So Judah, the southern kingdom, has this threat coming from the north. And so what happens is that they're upset. So in verse 3, Isaiah, along with this son named Jasheb, which means a remnant shall return. Okay, so remember Isaiah, when Isaiah's name, the salvation of Jehovah, or the Lord saves, remember that Isaiah names his children as God leads him to name his children based on the promises of prophecy. So when he says when Isaiah tells King Ahaz, he says, meet me at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. And everything about this is symbolism, because the aqueduct would bring water into the city of Jerusalem. And where they met was where the water came down and actually came into Jerusalem. So there's a lot of symbolism here that in this whole segment of Isaiah that refers to Jesus. Okay, remember Jesus said he's the water of life. Okay, remember Jesus said, I am the way, the washerman's field, or even the highway where they were meeting. So verse 4, it says here that, okay, King Ahaz meets Isaiah, and Isaiah has his son, whose name means the remnant shall return, which was a promise. Say to him, be careful and keep calm and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. So what God says through Isaiah to the King Ahaz, and what God is saying to the king, and God's saying to the people in the southern kingdom, is first of all, he says, listen, be careful, keep calm, don't be afraid. In other words, they got this threat coming from the north, and the first thing the prophet says is, listen, be calm, don't be afraid. You know, a lot of times when the enemy's coming against us, or we feel like the enemy's coming against us, and we have an enemy, the reality is that the enemy uses fear. Let me tell you, you're only to fear one thing, and that is God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The Bible tells us to fear the Lord. You know, I've always told you this. You know, my daughter, she was in the gifted program, the one that's a dentist. And I remember her coming home one day with a book that she had to read. And when she had gone through there and she had underlined how many times God's name had been used in vain, how much profanity was in the book. And she said she came in, never forget, sat down, high school, said, Dad, this is what the teacher's asking us to read, but I can't read this. I looked at her and said, well, what are you going to do? I wasn't some parent that was going to go down there and bully anybody or do anything. I had raised my daughter by that time to figure life out for herself. So my question, what are you going to do? Well, I can't read the book. Well, then what are you going to do? Well, I guess I'm going to have to go above the teacher's head tomorrow because the teacher will not listen. So the next day, she didn't go to the class. She went straight to the principal's office. The principal was a Christian, took the book and said, I can't read this. Now, the principal knew me, and he knew I didn't care nothing about her reading it. So my daughter, the principal at that point sends her to the classroom, calls the teacher's name over the intercom, and tells the teacher to come to the office. So as my daughter is going into the classroom, the teacher's coming out going to the office. Now the teacher got mad. She wasn't happy about it. Now, at the same time, she was a professing Christian in a local church. But the reality is, she came back, she gave my daughter a lot tougher book to read. And my daughter still did well. And then fast forward, I'll tell you this, I was doing a revival in that teacher's church. I was preaching in that teacher's church. She was sitting with her family up in the balcony. And during the invitation, toward the end of it, she came down, her husband came down. He was a very, very powerful businessman. They came down, and at the end of it, I looked at her. After I'd counseled with the family, I looked at her and I said, "You taught my daughter." It was a few years later, and she cried. She said, "No, your daughter taught me." God has not given you a spirit of fear. That's what Paul said to Timothy, but that's true of all of us. If you have a spirit of fear, if you have anxiety, if you're dealing with all of that, that didn't come from God. God didn't give you that. Your enemy, Satan, gives you that. So what happens here is that King Ahaz is meeting with Isaiah, and Isaiah says, God has a message for you. It is this: be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. And then look how God sums up these two forces to the north. He calls them smoldering, he calls them two smoldering stubs of firewood. In other words, they're nothing. They're smoldering, they're smoking, they're not even flaming up. They are no threat. That's what God is saying through Isaiah to the king. And then watch what he says here. In verse 5, Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah. That's Syria and Israel. Let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says: it will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, Syria, the capital is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. Now, what is he saying here? When in 722, the Assyrians, they were the world power. They would come in and they would destroy Ephraim, Israel, the northern kingdom. Now listen closely. They would destroy them in 722 BC, scatter them all over the Assyrian Empire, and Israel would not be reestablished as a nation until May 15th, 1415, 1948. So what God was saying through the prophet Isaiah to the king, he was saying, listen, you're worried about something that is no threat at all. And I'm going to tell you, that's what the enemy does to us. The enemy gets us in a state of anxiety and fear and worry to the degree we start what-ifing, and the enemy will fabricate. You know, I was talking to somebody and they looked at me, kind of counseling them, and they said, the problem is I'm married to somebody who turns a molehill into a mountain. Do you know anybody that does that? In other words, they turn a molehill, they turn nothing into a major mountain, and you have to deal with it, right? You know people like that? And so what God is saying through Isaiah the prophet, God is saying, you tell the king, be careful, don't worry, don't be afraid. These are smoldering stumps that will be no threat at all. In fact, God says that I'm going to deal with the northern kingdom, and I'm going to take care of them. They're not going to tear you apart. I'm going to tear them apart. Let me tell you, when you're a child of God, God protects you and watches over you. That's why we don't live in fear. You know, no weapon forged against me can prosper. That's what the Bible tells me. So, you see, but what the enemy will do, the enemy will take a molehill, turn it into a mountain. And that's what was happening with King Ahaz. Now in verse 9, the head of Ephraim is Samaria. And the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. Now let me tell you, folks, the next verse here, and I tell you over and over again, I don't mind you using your phones, but you literally need to get you a hard copy of the Bible for this verse. You need to double, triple, dog-ear the page of your Bible. If you have to, turn it, fold it over. Because this verse here is a verse that God has used so often in my life. Look at it. In verse 9, the latter part of it, look at what Isaiah says to the king. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you won't stand at all. Never forget that. You and I, we don't walk by sight. We walk by what? We walk by faith. We don't walk by fear. We walk by faith. So the reality is that, hey, listen, it's impossible to please God without faith. You're saved by grace through faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. You and I live, breathe, have our being. We literally live every day of our life by faith. The enemy wants you to live by fear. God says, you're not living by fear, you're living by faith. The just shall live by faith. Whether Habakkuk said it or whether Paul said it. Martin Luther, his life was forever changed, the great reformer, when he read those words, the just shall live by faith. But look what Isaiah says to the king. He says, if you don't stand firm in your faith, you're not going to stand at all. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of us are going to spend all our time wasting away because we don't understand the eternal security of the believer. The enemy fills us with fear. We think we've got to go back and do this, do that. We're not quite saved. Maybe I need to do it again. Maybe I need to get baptized for the 14th time. Maybe I need to pray the prayer another time. Maybe I need to do this and do that. Hey, listen, that's how the enemy wants you to live. And if you don't stand firm in your faith, you're not going to stand at all. You're not going to stand in your marriage. You're not going to stand raising your kids. You're not going to be able to stand in life. We walk by faith. And when I get up in the morning and I get into this, I'm building my faith. That's what I'm doing. So here you have it. Now verse 10, again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. Verse 12, but Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Now everybody, he sounds like just a great guy, doesn't he? Let me tell you, King Ahaz was a wicked king. This was just religious mumbo jumbo. This didn't mean anything. Let me tell you what kind of man he was. King Ahaz went into the temple treasury, took the money out of the temple, the gold and the valuables out of the temple, pawned them off, and bought out the Assyrians in order to defeat these two individuals. In other words, listen to this. Rather than King Ahaz listening to the prophet of God and obeying God and trusting God, he tried to figure out his own way to deal with the problem. Let me tell you what he did. He was going to pay off the Assyrians, who were a wicked, godless people, to come and take care of the northern kingdom, Israel and Syria. In other words, these two threats, these two smoldering stumps, as God called them, he's so filled with fear, he's spending money trying to hire the Assyrians to take care of him, and he gets the money by stealing the stuff out of the temple. If that's not enough, when he goes up there to meet the ruler of Assyria, he sees an idol that is in the northern kingdom. He's so captivated by the idol, he sketches it out, takes plans back down there, closes the temple of God, tells the people, you don't need to worship God. I got you an idol now. He has them make an idol. I think Uriah does it, makes this idol, puts it up, and leads the people to reject God and turn to the idol. So when he says, hey, listen, I'm not going to put the Lord thy God to a test. That's what Jesus said. You know what Jesus said? A wicked and adulterous generation asked for a sign. He says, I'm not going to put God to a test. I'm not going to ask for a sign. Now watch what Isaiah says, verse 13. Then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God also? You know what Isaiah says? He says to King Ahaz, why, you big hypocrite, you lying hypocrite. What do you mean you're not going to? God told you to ask for a sign, and you're sitting here pompous and pious, acting as if you're doing a religious thing. Isaiah sees right through him. I'm going to tell you one of the things I don't like a bunch of religious talk. You ever meet people, they just can talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk? I'm going to tell you, I sat yesterday, I took Johnny Gooch to lunch, and that was his honorarium for speaking Sunday. So I took him to lunch. We were sitting at the Renaissance. Afterwards, we were talking, just sitting out there under a shade tree. We were watching a handicapped parking spot. As we were watching a handicapped parking spot, a young man pulls up there, gets out with no regard whatsoever, had nothing to identify his vehicle as handicapped. He wasn't handicapped. He stayed gone for a little while, then he got in a vehicle and he left. And I said something to Johnny about it. A little while later, a young woman pulls up, gets out, nothing's wrong with her, gets out, does her business, and I don't know whether she came back or not. And I looked at Johnny and I said, I tell you the problem with those young people. They probably go to a church. They probably go to a church where they're taught they are entitled, empowered. They can disobey the law. They don't have to do anything. They can do what they want to do. And while a handicapped person has no place to park, they're able to get away with it. And I said, that's the problem of the church. And I said, the problem is so often we talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk. We don't even obey the law. And Antonio will tell you that that's the truth. You probably deal with a lot of people who profess to be Christians, but do not obey the law at all. And that's contrary to what Paul said in Romans. King Ahaz sounds good. He can talk the talk, but he's not walking the walk. And Isaiah sees right through him. So look at verse 14. In verse 13, he said, will you try the patience of my God also? This is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and we'll call him Emmanuel. Now, first of all, who is that? Jesus. Emmanuel means God with us. Virgin here, a lot of times you'll look at, if you've got an RSV, hopefully you don't, it will try to explain virgin away as a young woman. But a virgin is a woman who has never slept with a man. And this is what Matthew alludes to. Verse 15, he will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. So now we run into a problem. And the problem is this. We've said it every time we've looked at any prophet. When we went through the minor prophets, we said it. The prophet will be speaking about his time. All of a sudden he'll speak about the future. Then he'll come back to his time again. You see it over and over again through all the prophets. When you look at Isaiah, you look at Jeremiah, you look at Ezekiel, you see it over and over again. When you look at Daniel to Malachi, the minor prophets, you see it over and over again. Repeatedly, the prophets will talk about something in their time, and they'll talk about something in the future. Verse 17, the Lord will bring on you and on your people, on the house of your father, a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. In that day the Lord will whistle for flies from the distant streams of Egypt and for bees from the land of Assyria. They will all come. They will settle in the steep ravines and in the crevices and the rocks, on all the thorn bushes and all the water holes. And that day the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the river, the king of Assyria, to shave your head and the hair of your legs and to take off your beards also. In other words, everybody look this way. Let me explain here. Isaiah says to the king, what the king is going to do, he takes money out of the temple treasury. He goes and he buys the ruler of Assyria. He buys off the ruler of Assyria to take care of his problem, which is Syria and Ephraim, the nation of Israel. Am I making sense? What Isaiah is saying to the king of Judah, because you've not turned to God and you've turned to your enemy will do that. He's going to take care of Israel. In 722, he wipes the northern kingdom out, sends them into captivity, resettles the land. That's where the Samaritans come from. Samaritans were inbred between the Assyrians and other people and the Jewish people. That's why the Jew would go around Samaria in the New Testament. What Isaiah is saying to the king, he's saying, because you didn't turn to God and you turned to your enemy is not only going to defeat the threat that's against you now, your enemy's going to backfire and he's going to come down to take care of you too. Eventually what's going to happen is an Assyria will come down and they'll completely surround Jerusalem. You remember Hezekiah? The Assyrians will eventually be destroyed by the Babylonians. And between the Assyrians and the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, they will strip the land bare. That's what he means. When he talks about shaving your legs, he's talking here about, literally in the Hebrew, shaving your private parts. Your enemy is going to completely destroy you, destroy the land. That's what he's saying. Now read on here, watch this. Verse 21. In that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 goats, and because of the abundance of the milk they give, he will have curds to eat. All who remain in the land will eat curds and honey. In that day, in every place where there were 1,000 vines worth 1,000 silver shekels, there will be only briars and thorns. Men will go there with bow and arrow, for the land will be covered with briars and thorns. As for all the hills once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of the briars and thorns. They will become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep run. In other words, what Isaiah was saying to the king, your enemy's going to completely destroy the land. And the only thing that you're going to have cows and sheep that will wander over a wasted land, and you're still going to be taken care of, but barely. Why? Because you did not turn to God. Let me tell you what the enemy wants to do in your life. The enemy wants to fill you with such fear that you live your life with what if. You ever play the what if game? What if this headache's a brain tumor? This pain in my chest is my heart, I'm getting ready to die. My job, I'm getting ready to lose it. My kids are going to rebel and turn against. Hey, listen, the enemy will what if you and cause you to live in fear and anxiety. The enemy will constantly bring the worst case scenario to your mind to cause you to live in fear rather than walk by faith. And what you and I do, and this is what the enemy does. What does the enemy want? He wants to do what he was doing to the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah. He wants to do what he was doing to King Ahaz. He wants you and I to try to figure it out for ourselves. To turn to something other than God. So that we start, hey, listen, this is the great danger. Is you start answering your own prayers. Rather than waiting on God, trusting God, you start trying to manipulate something, some situation, borrow this, do this, liquidate this, pawn this off, go here, go to that person, go to this person. We're going to figure this out. And God's saying, yeah, you go ahead and figure it out. Because that's exactly what the enemy wants to do. And Isaiah was saying to the king, you go ahead and figure it out. You go ahead and go to your enemy. Because let me tell you this, everybody listen, if you don't hear this here, if you haven't heard nothing, listen here. Satan, the devil, can answer your prayers. When you and I are praying, and we're asking God to intervene or God to do something, and God may be preparing you, telling you to wait, trust Him, but the enemy overhears that prayer, and the enemy can come in and answer your prayer by a lot of times getting you to answer your own prayer. Sarah didn't wait on God. She decided she would answer Abraham's prayer and her prayer by going her own route. What was that? I'll take my servant Hagar, give her to Abraham, and we'll have a child through Hagar. We're dealing with that even today. So God says, I tell you what, you tell the king that route that he went, that attempt to take care of his problem his own way is going to backfire, and it's going to bring a lot of heartache. And that's exactly what happened. Chapter 8, verse 1, the Lord said to me, take a large scroll, write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher Shalal Hashbaz. Then I will call in Uriah the priest and Zechariah, son of Berechiah, as reliable witnesses for me. Then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said to me, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz, before the boy knows how to say my father or my mother. The wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. What does that even mean? It's believed that Isaiah's first wife died. He eventually remarried, and she became pregnant, and she had a son, and they named that son Maher Shalal Hashbaz, which means this: speed to the spoil. You say, what does speed to the spoil mean? What God was saying to Isaiah the prophet to say to King Ahaz is, hey, listen, my son's name is an indictment against you. Assyria, you turn to Assyria rather than God. Every time you hear my son's name will be a reminder to you that God is getting ready to bring judgment. The Assyrians are going to come in and they're going to wipe you out. You know, sometimes names are so critical. In doing the ceremony of Shelby and Jacoby, Jacoby's name means joy. I didn't know that. His mom and his dad named him Joy. In the ceremony, I brought up the fact that I had known Shelby since she was 7 or 8 years old. When I met Shelby, both Shelby and Kinsey, when I looked at Shelby, spent any time with her, even as a second, third grader, I looked and said to Alan and Celia, these girls are gifted. This little girl is gifted. She has written poetry that's won all kinds of awards, full scholarship to Duke University. She had 11 PhD offers and took Princeton on a full scholarship and will make more than I make in stipend while she's doing her PhD. And in the ceremony, I said this. I said, my thought was, who could win the heart of Shelby? And then I met Jacoby, this tall, good-looking young African-American, beautiful-looking young man. And when I looked at him, I said, joy camped out on his face. You know, the reality is that a name can speak volumes. My name means the peace of God. As if my mom and my dad wanted my name, Jeffrey, for me to know what the peace of God is. Do you know what your name means? Isaiah was saying to the king, my son's name will remind you of the judgment of God that is coming. You know, Martin Luther, Michael King Sr. had a son, Michael King Jr. Michael King Sr. traced the trail or the pilgrimage of Martin Luther, the great reformer. When he came home, Michael King Sr. looked at Michael King Jr. and named him Martin Luther King Jr. In other words, the great reformer his name would be tied to the name of the great liberator and the great civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr. Why? Because his dad, when Martin Luther King Jr.'s dad When Martin Luther King Jr. was 9 years old, his dad changed his name after the great reformer. A name is important. And what Isaiah says is, before my son is able to say father and my father or my mother, these threats that you see, Damascus, Syria, Israel, there'll be no threat. God's going to take care of this problem. But you didn't trust him to do that. Verse 5, the Lord spoke to me again, because this people has rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah. That means sent. And rejoices over Rezin. That means self-will. Rezin is also part of the name of Lucifer. What Isaiah is saying to the king, because you've rejected the gentle flowing river of Shiloah, and instead you have turned to Assyria, because of that, verse 7, therefore the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty floodwaters of the river, the king of Assyria, with all this pomp. It will overflow all its channels, run over all its banks, sweep on into Judah, swirling over it, passing through it, reaching up to the neck. Its outspread wings will cover the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. And you can write Leviticus 25:23, because let me tell you, that land in Israel, that's called God's land. So if you wonder why the world always finds itself arguing and fighting over the land that is around the geographical area of Israel, is because according to Leviticus 25:23, the land that is called the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel, that's God's land. Well, they've been cutting it up, dividing it up, trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. God says, no, that's my land. That is my people's land. That's the Jewish people's land. God says, that's my land. And God says to the king of Ahaz, he says, while you're turning to your enemy Assyria and expecting them to bail you out of this, God says, hey, listen, I'm going to send Assyria, and when they come, they're going to bring not a gentle flowing answer. They're going to be a rushing, violent, what we saw at Camp Mystic, what we saw happen in Texas. It's going to be like a flood that's going to come and bring destruction. Let me tell you, and let me close with this. We just got a few minutes. That's your enemy. You know, remember this. Satan, Lucifer, and Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 are going to give us a vivid picture of our enemy, Satan. So when we get to Isaiah 14, Isaiah is going to give us a vivid picture of our enemy, Satan. But let me tell you what your enemy does. If your enemy can get you to live in fear and anxiety, in worry, in what if, then the enemy can send you a false answer. The enemy masquerades as an angel of light. The enemy will do in your life what the enemy did in King Ahaz. He'll get you to think that he's the answer, that he's got the answer. Rather than waiting on God, you and I will jump ship and listen, we'll turn to ourselves, trying to figure out how to answer our own prayers. We'll listen to friends and other people rather than waiting on God. And before long, let me tell you something. We jump, as old people say, out of the frying pan into the fire. And there's a high cost to that. You know what the enemy wants? The enemy wants you to think your situation is so desperate, you better do something. You ever hear people say that? Well, you need to do something. You know what the answer to that is? No, you don't have to do nothing. You need to wait on the Lord, because they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. No, you need to wait on the Lord, trust Him, and wait for Him to give the answer. Or you'll turn to the enemy, and the enemy will give you an answer that God had no intention of you ever listening to. And let me tell you what the enemy has. The enemy has stereo. He has surround sound. He'll raise up people all around you, telling you so much stuff and confusing you that you won't have no idea what to do. He is the author of confusion. And he gets you desperate enough. You will literally, like I said, you'll jump ship. You remember when Paul and the bunch in Acts, remember, and we'll close with this and I'll pray. Remember, Paul told the ship, he told the owner of the ship, he told the captain of the ship, here this preacher, this prophet of God said, listen, we don't need to leave the harbor. We need to stay here. We need to winter here. But you know what the Bible says? The Bible said the weather looked good. The sea was calm. They rejected the word of God, rejected the man of God, and instead the owner of the ship and the captain of the ship said, hey, listen, we've been doing this a long time. Hey, preacher, you shut up. We're going to sell this ship. And you know what they did? They sold the ship anyway. And guess what happens? They get out there in the middle of a storm, and for day after day after day, that ship is to the point that literally they think they're all going to die. And you know what God says to Paul? He says, Paul, he says, you're not going to die. But you tell all of them to stay on the ship. Because you know what they were getting ready to do? They were getting ready either to kill the prisoners, or they were going to get on the lifeboats and try to make it to land. You know what Paul says? You do that, you're going to die. Stay on the ship. Don't touch anybody. In fact, Paul said this to the captain and the owner. He said, let me tell you, I told you so. If you'd have listened to me, you wouldn't be in this situation. But now you better listen to me. Stay with the ship, and everybody will be safe. Saved. That's exactly what God says to you and I. No, I'm about finished. Joyce, she's feeling sorry for me. But the reality is that's the message for each one of us. Trust the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. But in all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on lean and trust are the same word. Don't trust in your own understanding or nobody else's. A lot of times you need to trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. And in all thy ways acknowledge Him. Lord, that means prayer. God, I need you to help me out here. And listen, and He will direct your path. And all God's people said, amen. That's our prayer. You're free to go.